Our national debt is a problem. It's currently sitting at just about $30 trillion. Now, many people have pointed out that's just the official pile of debt, but debt is a liability. And if you count all unfunded liabilities, we arrive at a number that's about $100 trillion more at $123 trillion. Now, $30 trillion, impossible to pay back, let alone $123 trillion. So I'm going to explain what these numbers actually mean for the financial state of the union moving forward. Ready? Let's dive in. You know I follow Lynn Alden's work very closely. She's one of my favorites, and I regularly cite her work, talk about her articles, and she just wrote a recent article that's fantastic. I emailed it out in my newsletter this week. In the article, she pointed out a few key facts about the national debt that I find very helpful to summarize here. Take, for example, you or I. If you or I want to spend $10,000 and we make $10,000 this month, that's great. Very simply, you can only spend what you make. Last month, though, let's say I only spent $9,000. That means I had a surplus. This month, because I had a surplus last month, that means this month I can spend in excess of what I earned this month. I can spend $11,000 this month because it's $10,000 that I made this month, plus the $1,000 left over from last month. In addition to being able to spend prior surpluses, it's also possible to spend future surpluses. Because if I didn't have any surpluses from prior months, I can still spend $11,000 this month. I can borrow $1,000. Next month, though, I will need a $1,000 surplus to be able to use that to pay back the debt. So we see very easily that you can only spend what you make. And during a given time frame, if you spend more than what you make, it can only come from either a prior surplus or a future surplus. This is not only true of individuals, but it is also true of systems as well. The problem is this reality is clouded by the fact that we have very long time frames to observe. And during these long time frames, the total pool of wealth actually grows. In the prior example of an individual, this would be like that individual getting a pay raise. So borrowing $1,000 this month to spend $11,000, even though I only made $10,000, is no problem because next month I know I'm going to make $12,000. This would give me the ability next month to both pay off the debt and still have $1,000 left over. But the reality is that last month's debt is still spending future purchasing power. But that pain is masked by the fact that the wealth grew larger. Many people who get high-paying jobs very easily get caught on this hedonic wheel where they continue taking out more and more debt to fund more and more lavish lifestyles, and regardless of how high they work their way up the ladder, they're still never able to pay back, and they end up being many years worth of their income in debt, and then they're very fragile to what might happen in the economy or their job, to getting fired, anything like that, because they haven't spent any time building up surpluses in the past, and they've spent years worth of their future earnings already. Now, this is exactly the position of the United States. Over decades, it has slowly but surely spent more and more and more of its future purchasing power. For a while, this was relatively painless because the total pool of wealth was growing so much faster. Many pointed out the dangers in it, but again, it was relatively painless overall. But this has left the United States in the position of already having spent $30 trillion and committed to spending $123 trillion of the nation's future purchasing power. To put this in perspective, this number comes out to just over $700,000 per citizen. To put that in perspective, the average American earns just about $1.7 million in their total lifetimes. And that number is not skewed by high earners because this is the median, not the mean. And if you look at this chart by education, you can see where the vast majority of people are sitting. They're gonna be in that $1.7 million range, again, for their total lifetime earnings. That means that on top of taxes, the United States government has already spent about half of everything every American will earn in their entire lives. Now you might be thinking, well, how would they actually take this? Because they clearly can't just outright tax that much. And you're right, trying to tax that much would very quickly result in a total system collapse. So instead what they do is print. Now it's important during this discussion to look at the nuance. The money supply historically has expanded or contracted due to bank credit. When you go to the store, you swipe your credit card, that money is lent into existence. Now there are more dollars floating around in the system than there were before. At the end of the month, when you pay that credit card bill off, that money ceases to exist. That money is no longer floating around in the system. You pay that off, the debt contracts, goes away. The money supply does not expand from the government taxing. That's simply a transfer. Transfer your money to the government and then back out to wherever the government spends their money. Government employees' paychecks, government contractors, military companies, Medicare, Social Security. It's just a wealth transfer. The money supply also does not expand from borrowing because, again, borrowing, real borrowing, is just a wealth transfer. I'm going to borrow from you as a person, from you as a company. I'm going to spend it somewhere else as the government into all those same areas. It's, again, a wealth transfer mechanism. But over the last couple of years, we've seen a significant shift in what borrowing means for the government. It's no longer just a wealth transfer because they're not borrowing from individuals and corporations. They're borrowing from the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve gets their money by printing it. Now, again, some nuance. The Federal Reserve doesn't loan the money directly to the government. The Federal Reserve prints new dollars, they take that out to the open market, they buy up treasuries, and then all of that new money is freed up to do whatever it wants with. And so the federal government is essentially, when you track everything from point A to point Z, is creating new dollars that ultimately are lent to the government and fund government deficit spending that is in excess of what it borrows and taxes out of the economy. Under this situation, the money supply does grow as the government spends money into existence. At this point, the government no longer needs to tax or borrow in order to fund its expenses. It simply prints. But again, we need some nuance. Just because that's the mechanics of how the system works doesn't mean it works out that way in practice, because there are actual laws and fences put up in place that prevent this from being reality. There are limits on how much the government can borrow. There are limits on who can decide where the money is spent and how much. The Federal Reserve can't directly fund the Treasury. It has to do it indirectly through the bond markets. So, let's take it back to the national debt, because what in the world does all of that have to do with the national debt? Does this mean that the national debt is in reality meaningless now, since the federal government can print as much money as they need to fund their expenses? Unfortunately, no. Remember what I said about purchasing power earlier? Purchasing power doesn't change just because you can print money. Take the example of a pizza. The number of slices in a pizza represents how large that pizza is, right? Regular pizza, 8 slices. You don't end up with more pizza by cutting each of those slices into 2, getting 16 slices of pizza. You've got the same amount of pizza. It's just represented by more slices now. It takes more slices to get the same amount of pizza. Similarly, you don't get more wealth by increasing the quantity of the units that are being used to measure that wealth. More money is now required to get the same amount of wealth. Back to our example of paychecks. The only way you can spend purchasing power and use it is to have earned it either in the past, the present, or the future. You can spend all you earn this month. The only way to spend more than that is to have had a surplus in the past or have a surplus in the future. And remember, the quantity of money doesn't change the actual amount of purchasing power being used here. So whether the government can print or not, it's already spent or committed to spend $700,000 of your money, because the government, all it has is your money. It doesn't produce anything. All it is a wealth transfer machine. The only money they have is money they take from somebody else. And this fact doesn't change with a printer. All it does is change the number of dollars necessary to measure the same amount of purchasing power. So it's 700,000 in today's dollars. If the government finances 100% of its future spending from printing, it's still $700,000 in today's dollars. So if the money supply doubles, that number becomes $1.4 million. In purchasing power, that's still $700,000 of today's money. It just means that prices will double. And again, for the median American, that is half of everything that you'll earn in your entire life on top of what you are already being taxed. So what's the solution? Well, if they continue to pay for everything that's currently planned, most of your purchasing power over your life will be transferred to the government. That will result in a lot of angry citizens. There's no way around that. Now, if they don't, and they say we're no longer going to fund Social Security, Medicare, military, anything like that, there will be many who do not receive what they were promised, which means that for their whole lives, they paid into the wealth transfer system that gave other people what they were promised, and when it came time for them to get their due, they got nothing, which means there will be a lot of really angry citizens. Now, you might remember the caveat that I gave at the beginning of the video about a growth in real wealth, how for the past couple of decades, it has been relatively painless, all of this future spending, simply because there's been so much of a growth in real wealth that has counteracted it and covered it up. So theoretically, we could see a new technological revolution, machines and artificial intelligence, creating so much wealth that it would counteract all of the government financial stupidity. But on the other hand, most growth is usually funded by savers and investors. And how much wealth will be left over if all of that money, all of that wealth, all that purchasing power is being confiscated, transferred away from the savers and the investors? New technologies are hard to come by when the people developing them don't get the tools or the resources that they need. And as the government continues to become a larger and larger financial burden on the economy, the growth rate of the economy slows and eventually reverses. Which means that yes, in the end, the national debt doesn't matter in the sense of it must be paid off. It matters in the sense that it's already been spent. And that purchasing power clearly didn't come from past surpluses, which means that what was spent was future surpluses, future earnings, future growth. And that's true whether the printer turns on, ramps up, or shuts off completely. As always, thank you so much for watching. And if you haven't already, I'd like to invite you to join me, my new community on Locals, where I post content that is exclusive to my supporters there. I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.